All right, what the heck's going on, everybody? I got Jimmy to my right, Eric Barber across the table from me, and special guest, repeat guest, Pat Durkin, who is always a pleasure, always so insightful. And frankly, right now, though, I am having a hard time sitting here because we are at we're at essentially the peak of the rut. We're in the office. Eric killed a buck like 2 days ago. My phone is abuzz with
Paul
text
Neese
messages.
killed a buck like yesterday, apparently.
Yeah, just a giant. Kenny killed a really nice buck. Everybody, text messages are flying in.
Send Venmo for more license dollars.
Yes.
Because we need more licenses.
Yeah, Eric's having a complete conundrum over here over the fact of whether he should go get an Illinois deer license or not and potentially risk his wife leaving him.
Hey, make good choices, and you know what I mean by that.
Yep.
Anyway, so hence the topic for today's discussion. We're going to talk about the whitetail rut and all of its intricacies. Pat, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit, but Pat Durkin, longtime outdoor writer, Wisconsin outdoor writer, interviewed, I'd assume, a lot of really interesting folks about the rut over the years, and we want to learn more about it so we can hit the field here this week.
Yep.
And go get us some deers.
I just realized you don't wear a watch.
But I pretended like I did.
Yeah.
That was nice.
Freckle past a hair. All right.
Pat, go.
Keep throwing you off today.
I'm jacked up. I'm excited.
No food and a lot of coffee.
Well, regarding the rut, I was editor of Deer and Deer Hunting magazine back in the 90s, from 91 through 2001. And, I guess the thing that always kills me about magazine production was that, you have this, I think we had 8 publications a year. And you always had, it was just the same thing every year. And you got to get into that. I think it was always the October issue was always our rut issue. But Deer and Deer Hunting, one thing I always liked about and why I liked editing that magazine and being part of the early days of it was the guys that started it, the guy's name was Al Hofacker and Jack Brower, and they had the good sense to bring into the magazine Charlie Alsheimer out in New York State and Richard Smith up in the UP. But then by the time I arrived, my big coup as editor in 1993, John Ozolga, this great researcher over in Michigan, who'd been at the Cusino. It's like a big 1 mile enclosure up in the UP, Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He did all sorts of rut research over the years, and the rut's timing, licking branches, scrapes, rubs, all that kind of stuff. Especially scrapes, he did a lot of stuff on that, and different treatments on scrapes. So, anyways, the rut was always a big focus of those fall issues, and then you even get into the whole discussions of the second rut. And then you get one thing that was fun about doing that work was I got to meet these researchers from down south, and one of them was a guy named Larry Marchinton, who was at the University of Georgia, and he'd done a lot of the good scrape research back in the 70s and brought that along and had some of these early theories on how deer interact at scrapes. And I remember interviewing him one time and ask him, well, what do you think about the second rut? This supposedly that the first
I've never
rut,
even heard of this before. This is baffling.
There's this big, rut, and then there's the does and sometimes fawns, female fawns from that year's crop would come into estrus for the first time. And I always remember Larry saying, the second rut is a creation of outdoor writers. He said, it's happened, but he said it's so rare, it's nothing that you should really ever bank on. And you can, if you're out in the woods in early December, where we are now, right now, you might get that occasional doe coming into estrus, but typically the does get bred that first time around. There's very few of them that don't get bred because there's usually enough bucks running around in October to plant the seed. And if anything, I could babble all day about the rut and breeding with deer, but as time went on, they could start doing real genetic research on these deer and track their offspring. They were finding that some of these does were carrying around the offspring of 2 different bucks. In that 24-hour window that they have to breed, they weren't exactly
monogamous.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yes. Good way of putting that.
Yeah, and then they find too that a lot of the bucks in the breeding aren't always the biggest bucks around. They're the opportunists who work their way in there. When another buck chases off a second buck, the little yearling buck will sneak in and breed the doe, and then get out of there before the big buck comes back. So there's all these intricacies that we've learned over the years, and
wow,
it's fun stuff to talk about.
It's good strategy.
It's like a complete free-for-all almost just out there. It's what it seems like. And everybody always gets, it's funny around the office here, I have been noticing that an equally or a change of equal magnitude has been occurring in Eric biologically and physiologically, I believe. Probably as much so as the deer have been undergoing, because the guy has been off his rocker in the last week. It's just all of a sudden I see
gotta get in the woods.
Yeah, he's got that itch. He's kind of a little twitchy. He's very animated.
Yeah.
It is a magical time of year.
It's perfect.
It is.
It's the time that we all wait for all year long. Mm-hmm.
It always baffles me. I feel like in one of our podcasts prior, I mentioned this too, but just the fact that when you see deer, a lot of people will say, you'll shoot a buck and you say, oh, I think this is on a 2-year-old buck, or this one's a 3-year-old buck. There's like never a time where you would say, I think this one might be like 3.5, or maybe I shouldn't say there's never a time where you'd say that, but they all basically are all born within a couple weeks of each other, right?
Yeah.
In the spring, isn't it?
Right.
Yep.
Well, I always feel like
it all happens. Like all the deer are that way.
Yep.
It's crazy.
Yep. And going even back to what you alluded to there a little bit, Pat, with talking about Charlie Alzheimer's work. He did a lot kind of even around like moon-based stuff, correct?
Right.
And that's what's so interesting to me, because like Jimmy, as you're talking about that, like you can almost attribute to like, my wife's a nurse, and she always says that on nights when you get a full moon, people act up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to apply that to deer hunting. And I know Charlie Alzheimer had some awesome research that he dedicated a lot of years to that you would probably be able to speak to a lot better than I can.
I'd be happy to. The thing I'd say right away is that we had a real dispute right from the start with Charlie and John Ozolga. Ozolga really thought Charlie was just, not even in the ballpark with that stuff.
Yeah.
He really did not agree with it. He said that, that the rut's based on photo period, basically day length. And if you go back in time, you watch for fawns drop, it's the same real tight window every spring. Yeah. It's not varying by 3 weeks like Charlie's predictions were showing. And he really, it was actually a little personal. I mean, Charlie's passed away now, and John's still around. But I always felt, I remember having conversations with Charlie about, he was kind of hurt that I didn't just say that, no, we're all going to buy into his theory and make that the magazine's focus. And it's what it would push. And I said, Charlie, I look at Deer and Deer Hunting magazine as being the free marketplace for deer hunting ideas.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that, we're big enough, we're confident enough, we can have disagreements between our staff, our staff writers, and Ozolga has, he's really one of the top deer researchers this country has produced in deer. Mm-hmm. So how can I discount that man's profession? Whereas for you, it's not your profession. Mm-hmm. But still Charlie had these, I thought it was really interesting stuff. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of guys swore by it, and a lot of guys didn't. But I know Deer and Deer Hunting magazine had a calendar. I'm not sure they still do it or not, but Charlie had predicted, the rut sequences for years. And then Deer and Deer Hunting magazine would sell this calendar based off of Charlie's predictions.
Yep.
It was interesting stuff, and it wasn't just all Charlie's. It was another biologist. It was actually a biologist from at that time Maine. Wayne LaRouche was the man's name. And Wayne's actually working he might be retired now, but I have to fact check myself here. But I know I just saw him a couple of years ago at one of the deer conferences. He's working in Pennsylvania. And Wayne really believed, and Charlie and him kind of collaborated on that. So it wasn't like Charlie was just off in his own little world. He was basing it off another man's biological background, his research. So anyway, I guess in my opinion, my views have come to the point where I did a recent article for Meat Eater about lunar stuff, and I interviewed one of the guys I interviewed was Grant Woods, and Grant back in my day, in the mid '90s at Deer and Deer Hunting, we originally worked with Grant. Grant had been doing this research where he had a bunch of hunters out in I think it was like 3 different parts of the country. Every time they go out, they'd be logging in their data, logging in when they're hunting, what the moon phase was, and Grant had figured out all these different. When the moon goes across the sky, it doesn't just follow the same pattern every day. It's moving over the course of the year up and down in that horizon, and it's how far it is from the Earth
Right.
at any given time. So it's very.
And that has to do with the Earth tilting on its axis mostly, right?
Yeah, I think it's that, and plus I think the moon's trajectory actually does change.
Oh, okay.
But I don't. Grant knows all that stuff. But Grant had this theory where he was given based on the lunar stuff, where he was getting like a 70% success rate in predicting when these people would see deer, and he thought he's really getting to narrow down and nail down to making it real science, because that's what Grant is science. He's a deer biologist, a doctorate in wildlife management, and he came up with this chart then. I think it was called the Deer Activity Index. We published that in Deer and Deer Hunting magazine. We did stories out like Grant wrote. We published it. Hyped it up on our covers and did all sorts of publicity on it, and really felt good about the whole thing. He did that for a year, and he was even presenting the stuff to scientific conferences, and because he was that confident that he was getting into this stuff and getting this nailed down. Then he told me, this is for my Meat Eater article this past year. He said, and then GPS collars came along. He said, and then I realized I didn't know what the hell I was talking about. He said, when you can actually follow a deer's movements all day long and its activity all day long, just because we're not seeing it doesn't mean it's not doing stuff out there in the woods.
Right.
And he started to realize that anything you do that's based on your own observations is going to be biased, because you're going to be putting yourself in positions where you're most likely to see deer.
Yep.
And when they aren't there, well, they're probably still doing other stuff. So anyway, Grant did that for 1 year. We did this chart with us. Then he just kind of quietly disappeared. and I finally got around to interviewing him just recently. This is like 20 years after the fact. And I said, Grant, whatever happened to that Deer Activity Index? He just kind of sheepishly said, I was wrong.
Yeah.
Just totally wrong.
I've always been curious though. You talk like some people with moons. I know some guys that like they are bought in.
Yeah.
Like
Definitely.
the Kool-Aid is gone. They finished it a long time
You'll
ago.
never convince them otherwise.
Right.
And then other folks that are like, nope, it's a bunch of hooey. But my one question would be like, what with that theory, what is it that they think is increasing or decreasing that activity? Like, and I guess my question is like, I've thought like, okay, you get a super bright full moon, right? Like, I mean, it's almost, even as
you
a human,
can walk around.
Yeah, we can walk around. You can see good. I've always assumed that maybe deer or elk or whatever, they are possibly more comfortable in feeding more at night, and so maybe they're going to be less active during the day. Or is it somehow that they think the moon and where it's at is affecting the polarity of the Earth? And
I mean, it affects the tides, which when you think about how big and powerful the ocean is,
Right.
and you're like, well, if a moon can affect that, how could it maybe not affect
deer behavior?
Deer who would get swept away in an ocean, or something like that.
well, and then unrelated, but I know guys that are way bought into like
Rising
muskie fishermen
moons.
and like moon overhead, moon underfoot. So,
even Larry was mentioning that on our Fishing 101 podcast. He was saying if you wake up on a morning where you can still see the moon in the morning and the sun is coming up on the other side, that's a good day to go fishing. That's what he said.
And you'll hear deer hunters refer to that the same time on the opposite end of the spectrum, when the moon is rising as the sun is going down. That's a good evening hunt. They'll call that, and there's even a term like red moon or something.
Yeah, I've heard hunter's moon.
Yeah.
What the heck's a hunter's moon?
Hunter's moon is the October moon.
Okay.
I think it's the October moon, but
I believe so, because I think the rutting moon is the one that we're about to see on November 12th, which is the first full moon that occurs in November.
Mark's got the
Mark. Get him in the woods.
I swear, you get those like daily, just anytime people bring up deer.
I should say too that there's a professor down at Auburn University in Alabama named Steve Ditchkoff. when I interviewed him about, I think it was the same time did this article for Meat Eaters. So it's probably back about a year ago. I was doing the interviews. But Steve was telling me that some of his students are still working on some of this lunar stuff with the GPS collars and watching what the deer are doing. And he thinks they're getting close to having some decent predictability with it. But it's still, but I got the impression it wasn't like the kind of predictability where you can just go out there and really rely on it. I mean, deer are still going to be deer. The weather is still going to be the weather. And that's one thing Charlie always talked about, Charlie Alsheimer. He always said that weather would always trump everything.
Right.
You know, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep.
That was actually when you said that and you mentioned the word predictability. This is one of those almost philosophical questions that you think to yourself, but it is an interesting thought to wonder if we were suddenly able, by some scientific or biological discovery, able to suddenly predict where deer were going to be, when they were going to be there, why, at what times, where, in what ways will they be there. Is that good?
Right. Does it
Do you
cross
actually want that?
Yeah.
Do you actually want to just be able to show up and be like, yep, if I am here in 17 minutes, I'll get one?
I don't know what I would talk about every day if that happened.
Well, yeah.
Do we want complete and total predictability?
Yeah. And the unique thing with that, too, is like with the rut specifically, you might find a day that's absolutely classic, perfect conditions. You wake up, like this morning, we woke up, there's a hard frost on the ground, winds out of the north. Like it just felt like one of those days that you got to be out there.
And I saw a giant buck on the side of the highway, right next to a doe.
Everyone was seeing like deer on their way to work. It was like just one of those perfect mornings. But where I'm going with that is you could have that predictability that, today's going to be perfect. But the unique thing with the rut is it's so hit or miss. What might be going on, cranking up to 10 in the woodlot 1 mile to the east of where you're at, you might be sitting in dead space and you're not seeing anything. But all it takes is one doe to bring all the action into you, and it changes from 0 to 60 just like that. So that's the unique thing, I think, that we'd all kind of agree on with the rut, that it just can happen at any time. You don't really know. And that's why you get a lot of these guys that like to hunt all day and just spend as much time in the woods as they possibly can. So I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts on that? Like,
it really is like college.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's
the rut becomes like college, college weekend. You never know what's going to happen.
And you just got to be out there. But because if you're not in the game,
folk
you're out.
There.
Yep.
Then the party will be there.
Exactly.
That's why you stay at the bar till 2.
Exactly. Yep.
Sorry, I brought us off topic. Where were we?
No.
What are our thoughts on
all day hunting? I mean, is that something that you guys have done in the past?
If I can, I'm definitely. You're way bigger whitetail hunter than I am, Eric. But like this time of year, if I can hack and all day sit, or even if you're switching spots, but just like staying in the field as much as you can. But sometimes, man, it's tough. We got some cold mornings. That buck that I killed 2 years ago, I think it was 10. I think it warmed up to 10 that day. I mean, it was a cold day. I mean, I hunted till I think 10 a.m. and like couldn't feel my hands, couldn't feel my feet. Went to the truck, warmed up, and then hunted the afternoon and got lucky. But like you said, it can happen anytime, any place.
I used to hunt Ontario a lot back in the 90s and then early 2000s, and also the boundary waters of Minnesota. And I wrote an article for American Hunter magazine about 5 years ago about where I polled various people like yourself, and I could go down the list of different guys I polled to see if you had to pick one day to hunt the rut all day long, what day would it be? And the one I chose was November 8th, and as a fallback, November 9th. And it's not because anyone ever said to me or showed me data that made those dates, but that was just based on my own experience. Then if I was going to narrow it down further, I'd say I want to be in that stand, make sure I'm in that stand between 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, 10 o'clock a.m. and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when I've killed when I've killed during the rut. It's usually been in that time frame.
Yep.
But I still, because I'm just wired the way I am, I still get out there before dawn.
Yeah.
Get up in the tree or get up on the one I killed in Ontario was just sitting on a granite piece of rock overlooking an old clear cut, and so that's always been my experience. So the midday in that northern forest environment where there's just virtually no humans pushing deer around, when you see a running doe, you know she's probably running from a buck. Mm-hmm. And it happened enough times to where you just kind of got that confidence. It doesn't happen every day. It might only happen one time in a week-long hunt. But if you're not out there, though, it's not, it definitely won't happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen, too, in the past where, you'll end up getting down to adjust a stand or something midday. And this happened a couple of years ago. I was down hunting with Aaron in Iowa, Aaron Warbritton from the hunting public, and we were adjusting a tree stand midday, and we were walking through a bunch of oak leaves had dropped, and it was impossible to walk quietly through that stuff. You were going to make the sound of crunching leaves. And in doing that, deer can hear that stuff from way further away than we can. And we all of a sudden kind of ignited this little flurry of buck movement because I think those bucks thought we were other deer walking through the leaves.
Right.
Whereas if we just would have stayed put, those deer were clearly around us, and it took us getting down, making that noise. They got curious, and we had 3 or 4 bucks come in, and we were caught with our pants down because he's halfway up the tree. I'm at the bottom handing him things, and there's deer running all around us. And it's just let's get set up. So, if to your point, if you're not there and if you don't wait them out, you're almost shooting yourself in the foot.
Well, similar but different. I think this was last year or the year before. I generally use that climbing stand, and I was getting, it was just, actually I was getting in a little late, and it was just, it was shooting light. It was just shooting light. And I was climbing up. I was about 6 feet up in the tree, and you make a little noise because it scrapes against the tree a little bit. And, it could have been this buck was just walking through, but he was acting like he was responding to that climber going up, so again, I'm 6 feet in the tree. I got my bow on the ground, trying to hoist it up without me seeing it. He was on me in a second, but.
Kind of futile.
And it seems like from what everybody has said, and this is just, maybe, I don't know, elementary, but it seems like the deer are generally, and especially the bucks, are just generally more likely to make mistakes in this time of the year. They're very much, they just have a sense of urgency, if you will. I know every time I get a sense of urgency, personally, I screw stuff up all the time.
Exactly.
So, then all of a sudden they have this just innate desire to just get what they got to do done.
Yeah.
They're distracted, they're aggressive, their emotions are high, they're doing things that they just otherwise
it's extremely
wouldn't do.
Stressful for them too, isn't it? From everything I've gathered, don't bucks come out of the rut
they lose weight, incredible amounts of weight they shed. You feel a buck. Typically, even if you shoot a buck in our gun season here in Wisconsin, late November, I always feel their back, and they're always run down. There's no fat up there. And you pull their hide off, and there's no fat on their hips, or just a little bit of fat.
Yeah.
So you know what they've been through.
Brutal.
The thing that one of those things that always kills me about that rut is you sit here and you try to figure it out, and then you realize. I hear guys talking about, bucks do this and bucks do that, and then you start getting down to what Jimmy was just saying about it's basically a routine that these animals are in. A deer is either, I would say, they're either scared or they're dead. If you knock them off their routine in any way, I think we can all relate. If you think, what do we do? When do we get ourselves in the most trouble? It's when we fall out of a little routine we're in. And the one that always haunts me as a deer hunter, I'm always referring to these stories. I sound like such an old guy, but a story I wrote back in the 90s was about tree stand accidents, interviewing guys who have been through tree stand accidents. And what happens in so many cases, they'll get up on their stand, and then something will be a little bit different that morning. A deer will be walking through in the dark, and they'll stop. And instead of hooking on like they normally would, they forget. Yeah. Because now they're trying to figure out where this deer is going by.
Yep. Yeah.
And then the one that always haunts me, the story that to this day is like 25 years later, this guy had that happen to him. He got up in the stand, and he heard a noise, realized it was a deer, and he just watched and finally the deer went by, and you just hear it, and never did see it. And he forgot to hook on. Well, later on, a buck comes walking by. And his habit was to always lean out from the stand until he felt that strap come pull him. And once he had that strap pressure. Then he draws bone. Well, he started leaning out. Well, he kept going
Oh no.
and ended up paralyzed for life.
Oh my
And
gosh.
you think it's not because this guy's stupid or
Yeah.
or was in a fog. He
Yeah.
just got out of his routine, and I mean, forget it for a second. And then I think the same kind of stuff happens to these bucks. You know, they're so focused
Yeah.
on getting that scent, finding that doe that's in estrus.
Yeah.
That they just get too focused, and they're not fools. They just they got
Yeah.
they got their mind elsewhere.
Right. Exactly.
Their priority is changed for a couple days.
Yep.
Oy. Is the time of rut, is it different for the does as well? Are they undergoing? I mean, it sounds like they're in estrus, but does that make them behave differently? Or
There's some evidence of that. One of the things they came across recently with these GPS studies is these does that would go off on these. They call them excursions. They'll go out almost in a straight line sometimes, like 2 or 3 miles, and then come back. And and it's one of those things. Science can always show you the what they did. They can't give you the why. Answering why with people, with deer, whatever it is. I kind of get when I hear guys going on and on about why deer do things. I think, well, your guess is as good as any.
Right.
I'm not going to argue with you.
Yep.
yeah, it's true because we can't speak deer.
The unique thing with those excursions that you talked about, Pat, is we talked about this a little bit before we jumped in here. So the Wisconsin DNR is doing that Southwest study,
Right?
And what they're doing is they're collaring deer, fawns, bucks, and does, deer of all ages, and they're able to monitor their GPS coordinates. There's one, we can actually pull it up, and we'll try to get this in the show notes and see if we can get access to the pins. But anyways, this for people who are familiar with the area here, we're in southwest Wisconsin, and just a little bit north of here is a town, or northeast of here is a town of Mount Horeb. There was a doe that came all the way from, I want to say, out towards Spring Green or Arena, which is about 21 miles to the northwest, and started on the north side of the Wisconsin River, crossed the river, and this was around this first week of November time frame, and over the course of 2 days, made the 21-mile trek to the south and east to the town of Mount Horeb, where she stayed put for a day or two, and then she went back and she got hit by a car crossing Highway 60.
You are kidding me.
Yeah. Incredible. So
I think was that the one that and she not only went back,
she did it multiple.
she almost did it on a perfect reproduction.
So this was
retracing the steps.
Multiple years in a row she did the same thing?
No, this happened last year she did this. But what Pat's getting at there is if you take your Onyx and you go into the woods and you start a tracker trail, you would go in, and now if you were trying to stay on that track coming back, looking at your map, it's almost hard for you as a person to stay right on that path. Well, here's a deer that came from 21 miles away.
Oh.
Went to the southeast and literally almost retraced her trail perfectly in her tracks going back to her...
Without Onyx.
Without Onyx. Yes. There's your woodsmanship lesson, folks.
Well,
pay more attention to deer.
It's hard to type with hooves.
Yeah,
That's
is.
Probably why they don't use
Touch
it.
screen.
Yeah, I don't even know
Terrible.
if the touchscreen works, just the way that what their hooves are made out of.
Yeah.
We should start. Somebody should make a type of glove for deer that allows them to use
The cards they were dealt.
But it's incredible, those excursions. And I want to say, this time of year, they'll actually kick out their fawns from the previous year. I thought, even in a Deer and Deer Hunting magazine a couple years ago, I thought I read something of a nub buck that was, pushed I think it was up to 20 or 30 miles away.
Oh, really?
I
didn't see that.
I could be misquoting that, but it was along the same lines with that Southwest study. It was a different study that the DNR was doing up at that time in central Wisconsin.
So it was pushed that distance? What do you mean by that?
So and I think young bucks are a little bit different animal when it comes to does.
Right.
So it was a yearling buck, so a nub buck that was...
Go ahead.
No. I'm all ears because what I want to say is it was pushed away.
I always correct people when they call nub bucks yearlings because they're not yearlings till actually a year old.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's actually a buck fawn.
Buck
in the
fawn.
fall.
Yep.
Okay.
So the buck fawn was pushed off, and I want to say they'll do that to a doe will do that to both fawns,
Oh,
whether it's
yeah.
a buck doe. That's for,
Right.
a moot point.
Is she pushing that deer off? Is he naturally dispersing, or is he getting pressure from more mature bucks in the area that's making him leave?
That is a fantastic question.
My guess,
Yeah.
just again,
Yeah.
that's what I said earlier about us trying to figure out what a deer is up to.
Yep.
I'm guessing that when the doe pushes her fawns off, they're probably somewhere close by usually.
Yep.
Because they do always reunite. And it's usually not that long that they're gone. But that'd be an interesting thing in that research to see what they're finding as far as if they're tagging fawn.
Yeah.
No, I mean maybe they're not because they do a lot of tagging in the winter.
Okay.
So I'm not sure they're tagging any young of the year fawns for that research, but it would be interesting because my theory,
Yeah.
my assumption is that one thing we know about the buck fawns is that they are more, if you're a guy you think they're more adventurous. If you're a girl you say he's more stupid.
Yeah.
He's just more careless.
Yeah.
Chances are, because this is the behaviors you see in some of these animals, like on the young mountain lions.
Yeah.
A young mountain lion male will go off. We've documented it over 1,000 miles.
Yeah.
Go off looking for new territory. Where you wonder when that little buck's confused and his mom drives him off, if maybe he just gets nuts for a little bit and starts walking and figures out, well, now I'm too far from home. Can I get back to mom? Comes back. I don't know. Without the research to show that, I wouldn't know. But it makes sense to me that maybe that little fawn might go wandering off more than.
Yeah.
But then again, you'd think the two of them would want to hang around each other.
Right. Right.
So who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah, they go off, and another fun thing about that the research has shown though the buck behavior. Down in Texas at this King Ranch, they do a lot of research on buck movements. They find that these bucks are individuals. One buck might go off a long ways, explore new territory in the rut, and other ones stay right in that core little area. They're more active in that core area. And I heard a talk by this Dr. Carl Miller down at University of Georgia where he said it makes sense that you'd have these different bucks behaving differently. And to have success one way, if he goes off 3 miles and finds a doe over there, well, next year he thinks, well, that worked last year, or whoever deer think.
Right.
And his experience was that this strategy worked, so it does it again. But if a buck stayed close to home and has found his mate or mates that way, well, chances are he'll do it that way again. It might just be a random thing that happens the first or second year that they just keep repeating them, for however short life, they're granted. So it's always
it does make sense
fickle
though.
stuff.
Like and I don't think we're any different. Like if you find something works, you kind of repeat that behavior.
Yeah.
There was going off that. There was a deer several years ago that when I used to work at Midwest Whitetail, our boss was hunting this deer, Bill Winkie. It's a deer that a lot of people would know about, but he hunted this thing on a 40-acre tract of land, and you look at a 40-acre tract, and especially when you talk, to wildlife biologists and learn more about like a buck's core area and home range and all that stuff, much bigger than a 40-acre area. But this buck was such a homebody, and it lived in like this one specific area. He was to the point where he would see this deer, even during the rut, almost every time out. And it took him two or three full Novembers to finally kill that deer.
Amazing.
And it literally lived in like a 40-acre area. And then you'll see these other bucks in these GPS collared surveys where they become total nomads, and they just start roaming. Yeah. So it really is an individualistic thing when it comes to buck behavior.
Yeah, and that shows up in study after study after study. I remember back in the 90s when all I had was these radio telemetry collars and these big honking things they put on these bucks, and they'd be out there with these those big antennas trying to triangulate where they are. I mean, you're talking about labor intensive, but they did that in a suburb of Minneapolis back in the early 90s. Jay McInich and some of his students when he was at the Minnesota DNR. And they tracked these bucks in these suburban areas. And same thing showed up in these urban bucks. Some were homebodies, some went wandering off, crossing these multi-lane highways around Minneapolis, and eventually come back, and some got hit by cars. And But It's been done enough now with different research where they don't find that predictability between the individual bucks where you think, well, they are individuals.
Yeah. Yep.
Have they found anything where you look at a young buck versus an older buck and any correlation as to, like, I would think that it would be the younger one that might be more prone to being nomadic, if you will, and then the older one is a little bit more like, well, I'm going to stay put, or maybe it could be the other way around.
I think they have. I have to go back and do some refresh. I get kind of nervous when I rely strictly on memory, but I think there is something to that where the older buck might start settling down into a smaller area and is working it. Mm-hmm. But God, it seems to me that I've read that too. Because I've probably written it, but my problem is I don't know. I go back and read some of my stuff from even a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and I think, God, I guess I knew that at one time.
Yeah. But yeah, it would seem to. I feel like I've heard people when they discuss just sometimes the way that older bucks act around a certain area compared to the younger bucks. The older buck tends to kind of hang back and sort of watch over a group of does or something like that. Whereas the younger ones kind of come in and they're trying to find. Yeah. They're trying to essentially find where they belong a little bit.
Well, then there's this Val Geist up in. He's a retired professor. I think he's in his early 80s, been up in Calgary, but he always had the theory of the shirker, and basically a buck that would shirk his reproduction responsibilities, almost like asexual, and that he said some of these biggest bucks out there are ones that really aren't all that sexually motivated. They would just kind of hang back and put all their energy into their antlers. I mean, they don't do it consciously, but that's what happens when they're year after year, they're just not really that sexually motivated to be pushing around, looking around. But he said these shirkers would come out that he'd observed these in mule deer. He'd watch these big bucks come walking out of these real good, tough, thick underbrush, and then see another buck that might cause him some problem and just disappear back in the brush. Didn't want any kind of confrontation.
Really?
Just didn't have that that typical buck-like stuff that we always treasure.
Interesting.
And then you talk to the guys who have these deer farms, and they purposefully keep bucks at low stress levels so they can put all their energy toward the antlers.
Oh, right.
And because anytime there's stress, anytime there's disease or sickness, is taking that when they're in that growth cycle. The more stress they're under that time, I guess it affects how they grow their antlers. The amount of energy left to put into the antlers. So there's some fascinating stuff about those. And another thing about the game farms, I remember going on to one of them. They have, if you look at them, typically they have where the deer are spending most of the time. They'll have like canvas up or plastic up against the fence, so nothing from the outside can distract them, scare them.
Geez. Oh, really?
So they kind of almost live in this
kind of
environment,
a
bubble where they don't have that pressure of that scaring of coyotes or dogs or else might be on that perimeter. So they really try to control those kind of things as much as possible.
Wow. Do those deer? And not that I really expect us to be talking much about game farms, but now I'm curious. Do those deer go through the same sort of rut timing and activity thing that the other deer do? Is that's not something that they learn by seeing other deer doing? It's just sort of in them programmed.
Yeah, because most of those whitetails at some point were not in the too far distant past were wild animals.
True. Yeah.
When you I think too, if you were to put up a big fence in Wisconsin or most states, I think they either try to get you to force all the deer, as many deer as you can, and then there's some states make them pay for whatever deer remain inside that enclosure. Then the other ones are, in the old days, I mean, there was cases where, I remember when I worked in Oshkosh at the newspaper up in Oshkosh back in the 80s, I remember the warden working on these cases where a game farm would get to the point where they have too many deer, and they'd open the gates and let them out every now and then, which you're not supposed to do. So you'd be investigating that.
Yeah.
And so you think, well, there's always been some of that, but it's really clamped down now in the CWD era we're in now, where this stuff isn't laughed at anymore. It's serious stuff now, and people do anything that's a little bit untoward.
Yeah.
You know, so it's just a different world now we're in.
You know, you're talking a little bit about, you know, second rut. And actually, so I was actually curious when we were thinking about doing this podcast, like the word rut, like to me, you know, you think like, oh man, I'm stuck in a rut. And it's like this kind of like almost like a negative connotation.
Yeah.
I'm like, so why is this like this magical rut? Like, why is it even called the rut? So I did look that up, and apparently it comes from a Latin word. Now, I'm not going to say the Latin word because I'd probably mispronounce it.
Give it a shot.
Meaning roar.
Right, roar.
Which I find also interesting because when you go to like New Zealand and you got the stags, when they're in their rut, they call it the roar.
Mm-hmm.
Which I found,
Oh, really? They just call it the roar.
like, yeah, they'd be like, if they were referring to the stag rut, they'd call it, oh, it's the roar right now.
Yeah, they're roaring hard right now.
and that's not necessarily because they, get up on top of big rocky peaks and roar.
Oh, no,
into the
they actually
sunset.
make
Yeah.
like a very hoarse bugle.
Yeah, well, I think it originated over in Europe with the red stags. You know that when they roar, when
Right.
like elk bugle, and these sika deer out in Maryland, you know, that are invasive or not really invasive. We brought them here and so I guess-
Non-native.
non-native. Thank you, but they have that
Melting
same
pot.
kind of. And then but I think it was a bastardization of the word roar that ended up being rut. You know, that's how words mutate over time.
Which I completely sidetracked myself there. But anyway, so you're talking about the second rut, but you hear people talk about the pre-rut, the rut, post-rut. You hear about lockdown phases. You hear about the October lull.
Right.
Yeah,
Kind of
because
like
not everybody is just hunting or just killing deer during the rut.
during the rut. And I feel like, and this is stuff I've heard, but it kind of makes sense, like, that the actual rut, or what I envision like as like the peak of the rut when you're seeing all this activity, actually isn't the rut. Am I right? Is there merit to that?
Wait, what?
Like that's almost like what I love about the rut or this entire time period is probably like more pre-rut than actual rut, I guess, where bucks are like they're moving and they're dogging does, but maybe those does like they're maybe not ready yet, but they're getting close to being ready.
Yeah. Because I think what you're referring to there is almost like that peak rut time frame when bucks are tending does is that lockdown phase that I think you kind of,
it can be slow some days.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes just from the fact that, a buck might get with a doe and he literally may not leave her side. If she's bedded down, he's going to be bedded down and he won't leave her side for, a day and a half or something like that. And I think during that time frame, you see a lot of it's feast or famine. If you have that doe nearby you, you're going to have that buck and probably several other, you hear satellite bulls and elk hunting all the time. You might get that same effect in the whitetail woods of younger bucks trying to get in on that doe. But like we kind of talked about a little bit ago, if you're just a little bit off from where their location is, you can be sitting there like a fish out of water.
Yep.
So yeah, I don't know. I mean, that it is an interesting thing to think about that way because it really can be feast or famine.
Right.
So.
Where I think like maybe a little bit before that, before those bucks are fine, and these does, I mean, they're not all coming in the exact same time, same day, and so I mean,
awful high percentages, right? I think it's like almost like 70% occur in one little block of time, and then there's the ones that start a little bit earlier, and the ones that start at the end,
right?
And so when the more active does there are, more estrus does there are, of course, then you're probably going to see a lot more activity as they're running around, being chased and drawing bucks in. And if you're in a real high deer density area, you're probably seeing deer all over the place. But like when you go up in the forest, northern Wisconsin or Minnesota, Ontario, those areas, there's not many deer. But when the rut's on and these deer are moving, it's funny how I remember one day I was up in the Boundary Waters, and I over the course of a day, around probably again my favorite day, November 8th. I was still hunting and came across 4 different bucks that day. And one of them, if I just would have, I still
haunts them, I can tell.
Still bothers me at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I was taking a nap, but not really sleeping. Just had my eyes closed. I hear it. It's like your description earlier of this activity walking. I can hear this deer going through the leaves not too far away. I jump up, get the rifle on him, and I realize, as soon as you see that rear leg and the way it was built, right
Big
away
deer.
you know this is a big deer. And then I could see a flash of his antler. I thought, this is really a nice deer. And I always second guess myself that I thought he was just going to step out and I'd have a crack at him here. And I always think I should have just yelled and to stop him. But he, instead of walking that way, he just kind of curled it that way. And next thing you know, he's behind these trees and I lost him.
Oh, man.
But then the next day, the day before that, nothing. Day after that, nothing. But that day, it seemed like I could not get out of bucks. One buck was an 8-pointer I passed up. I had him for early in the morning.
Yeah.
And that one happened at around 1. And then before the end of the afternoon, I'd cross paths with 2 of their forked bucks where I could hear them coming, doing a little grunt coming through the woods. And the next day, I thought, man, I'm in a hot spot.
Yeah.
I went back, hunted that same reason. Never heard a peep. Never saw anything. And I think, well, I'm sure there was a hot doe in that area, and or a couple of them, and these bucks were after her.
You mentioned the noises that a couple of younger bucks are making, and I know I've heard of people utilizing tactics like grunts, rattling, scraping,
bleats,
that kind of stuff. During, I guess I hear people say a lot of those things just sort of during hunting season, but just because I'm not as up and up on it, are you doing that stuff more during the rut because it's you're playing on their agitation, their stress, and their proneness to sort of jump on something if they hear it, or is that stuff you're also doing outside of the rut, more pre-rut, post-rut? What's up with those things, those tactics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely something that can apply as early as opening day in the season. I mean, literally as soon as and I'm curious to hear what you guys have to think about this too, but as soon as bucks strip their velvet, they're going to start sparring with one another and determining that pecking order. So it can definitely, something like rattling or grunting, those vocalizations can be useful regardless of the calendar date. But I think right now we're sitting here at kind of like that peak pre-rut that leads up into like your rut kickoff, I guess. And I don't think there's any time in the year where it's as effective as it is right now, because you just have their testosterone is built up, rattling and stuff like that. You're playing off that aggression, that tendency that they have to come and get curious, where, as maybe a month ago, they might have heard that, but they're just not as receptive to it as they are right now. So I don't know. That's my thoughts. What do you guys think?
I mean, I agree 100%. I mean, I think it's happening now. I mean, this is when it's happening. You got bucks that, if you sound like another buck, or let's say you're grunting, he might think, oh, maybe that buck is on a hot doe. He may not even be coming in. At least these are like my speculations, right? He may not be coming in to fight. He may be coming in to take what that other buck might have, or maybe you sound like a buck that he doesn't even know about, and he wants to see who's in his territory.
Can I ask, are you doing these sort of vocalizations or sounds after you've heard a deer in the distance or something, or you sort of know there's one out there, you just don't know where it is? Maybe you already have seen it, or is it just silence in the woods, you have no idea if anything is around you, and then you just kind of like a turkey call almost, you kind of just... Is that how it's working?
I'd say both.
Yeah.
All of the above?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's two trains of thought there. You'll get some guys that want to be a little more cautious and only want to, vocalize or try to call to deer that they can actually see, because I think a lot of calling is playing on the right deer with the right mindset. It takes literally the same buck an hour later may not be receptive to that call just because he's not in that mood. Whereas if you can, see that deer, grunt at him, rattle at him, and gauge how he reacts to that, you're going to know, whether or not he's receptive to committing into that setup. But on the other hand, there is the strategy of blind calling, where you really don't know what's around you, make a ton of noise, and a lot of times, deer are going to, bucks especially, come in downwind of that. So I think the caution that some folks have with that is they don't like getting busted. So they tend to be a little bit more cautious when it comes to doing that blind calling.
Yeah, the one thing I've learned the hard way, and one thing I'll preface it by saying, though, is that one of the great things about being an outdoor writer is that you learn early in your career, at least I did, that you're not in the same category typically as the guys who are really good at this. I mean, when I talk to guys like Bill Winke, Greg Miller, the late Gary Clancy, some of these guys who are really superior whitetail hunters. God, I learned real quickly. You're not in their category. It's better to have them either interview them or have them write about, because they're out there all the time. I mean, they really have. I think they have instincts and insights that I'll never have. But the one thing I have learned though is that when you do rattle, if you're on the ground working an area, don't stop and rattle until you have the right setup that you're setting up with the idea that this is going to work. You got to have this every time you stop and rattle. You got to have this idea that this is going to work this time, and then make sure you're set up where you can take advantage of it. Because, like you're saying, that buck will, God, always come in downwind. And I've done enough times up in the forest where you'll just be walking around rattling, just rattle every now and then. Well, yeah, 99 times it doesn't work. Well, then finally it works, and you're now in a spot where it's all thick brush downwind to you. And sure enough, they come right in behind you. You can hear the twig snap. You know they're got their nose up, and they're just and there's just it's quiet, and they're gone.
Yep.
So that's always my advice to people: when you rattle, make sure you're in a spot where you're confident it's going to work this time. And if you don't have that spot where if you start rattling and you don't have that right open area behind you where it's semi-open, where you can actually see something moving through there downwind to you, don't rattle there.
Yeah.
But I used to always just walk along, rattle. Finally, it happened enough times where I realized quit rattling unless you're set up in the proper spot
where you can shoot downwind.
And then don't be standing out in the open. So many guys do that. They walk down logging roads, and it happened to me again. Rattle. Next thing you know, buck's right there, right, looking at you from the edge of the woods, and he's got you pegged.
Yeah.
But I think that comes from that lack of confidence. You gotta have confidence that this is gonna work.
Yep.
And if you don't have that confidence, don't rattle.
Right.
Yeah. It's kind of weird when you actually get really busted by a deer.
Yeah.
Because I guess and this is just sort of a random thing. It really has nothing to do with almost anything. But I just was thinking about it. Like, if you were out there and there were people out in the woods or something like that, and a person saw you and stared straight at you and sort of knew that you were after him or whatever, and then ran off, it'd be like a really spooky experience. You know? But when you see a deer see you, it's just kind of oh yeah, well, saw me, whatever. And it's just sort of, I mean, that you don't know that deer doesn't know you.
Yeah.
You're that deer thinks you're trying to kill it. You know, it's just sort of
because I am.
Yeah, because you are. It's a very odd, peculiar interaction that we have with
predator
deer.
prey.
Yeah. Tony Peterson always talks about the fact that if the roles were reversed and if people were constantly being hunted by grizzly bears, how different we would actually act.
Oh, so much, yeah.
And when you apply that to deer hunting, especially, people park in the same parking lots, they walk down the same trails. Those deer learn really quick what areas to avoid. And, it almost takes that creative approach kind of that we're talking about here is not getting caught out on the logging trail and paying attention to what's downwind. When you start applying that, it's you can really you can look at a map and you can really start removing chunks hey, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. And then before you know it, you just took 500 acres and now you got 60 acres that you can really kind of focus in on. And I think that analogy that Tony has is super interesting.
And
that totally makes a lot of sense for sure.
The hunting public were the first people that I had heard mention it this way, where they had said that if you're driving down the road or something, you see deer off the side of the road, whereas a lot of people that I know when I grew up, it was just kind of look, deer, and then it was cool, and then you drive on, it's well, all right, that happened. Well, now when I see deer, I'm okay, well, why are there deer there? What's nearby? What is the terrain like? What's the weather like? What's this? And all of a sudden you start trying to do your own little scientific analysis of why that deer might have been there. And
what time of day is it?
Right.
I mean,
Well,
everything.
Hunters definitely look at the land a lot differently than the average person. You're so all your hunting life, you learn real quickly, even if you're not quite aware of it, what areas look deery, whatever word you want to use. You get pretty damn good at picking that stuff up. One guy I know that I hunt with every now and then up in the Boundary Waters. He's from New London, Wisconsin.
Okay.
But he was telling me where he picks his areas to hunt in the Boundary Waters, and it's always during the rut. He said he'll be still hunting through an area. When he gets to a spot that makes him think of, this looks like Wisconsin, and where he's in central Wisconsin, where it's deer, where it's all deer country, basically. All that farm country and the marshes and the edges of where a wetlands merges into a woods. When he comes into those little areas that make him think of Wisconsin and not northern forest, that's typically where you find the deer. And I think, I can buy that. I know what you're saying, because there are lots of spots where I hunt in northern Wisconsin for the most part. It's up in Ashland County, not too far from Mellon. And the particular part of the forest I hunt there because my friend Shaq is there. If I were to go up there and hunt on my own, that's the last place I'd probably go hunting.
Yeah.
Because it's really mature black spruce and some tamarack, but a lot of balsam fir. Just not good deer habitat. But I always pick on him. I said, even the wolves don't hunt here. But it's really just not good deer habitat. But there's we have just enough coming through where we get one every now and then. But it's not like where I hunt in the boundary waters or where I used to hunt up in Ontario, where you look for those areas that have this cool interface of that marshland and the woods and the old blowdowns or fire areas that had fire. You go in there. Sometimes you can actually get your clothes will get black from the soot on the and this is stuff that was burned years ago, but it still has that black charcoal to it.
That's pretty wild.
It is interesting how you somehow, like, whether you do it intentionally or not, like you compile like these, maybe just this data in your head where you just know like a spot is deery. Or when I was in Washington last week, we're driving down this logging road, and I didn't even get the words out of my mouth. I was about to say, man, this road looks grousey, and then here they go, know?
Right.
And like, and I thought to myself afterwards though, like, well, why did I all of a sudden go, there's going to be grouse right here, and I actually still can't even pinpoint exactly why, but it was just like
right.
It was perfect. It was like the right around amount of cover, and there was shade, and I think there was a creek coming through, and just like for whatever the reason, like I don't even know what foliage was around me at the time, but I was just like, oh man, this looks good, and there they were.
Yeah, that's cool.
Well, that's one of the fun things I've found too with being an outdoor writer. There are guys that just talking to them briefly, and you look at what they've done over the years hunting, like these guys are really good at this. But you try to get them to describe what it is that they're acting on, and some of them can't do it. That's why I think guys like Winky and Tony Peterson's are folks who are making it as outdoor writers, but also deer hunting experts. They have the ability to put their thoughts into words, and they're able to somehow form that thought that they can relate to other people what they're seeing. But even then, I think that's probably why there's been so much success with like podcasts and TV shows where they actually show it a little bit. Where some of that stuff is really hard to explain in writing without. In the old days, you do all these maps and stuff and and try to give guys an idea of what you're doing, but still not as graphic as the actual video footage or something.
That's the coolest thing about where we're at right now in the hunting community. I mean, there's definitely a lot of stuff that we can do better at, but the cool thing with where we're at now is there's never been a better time to come into deer hunting.
Oh my gosh!
Slate. You can I mean, not to beat Tony Peterson to death, but he's got that thing that he's doing right now, like How to Kill a Buck, where he literally like overlays the map and like talks about what he's looking for and all that stuff. And it's interesting to see and get into the minds of some of these people who, like you mentioned, are proven and can actually articulate their thoughts. Whereas, then there's people on the other hand who are great at it, but they can't tell you what kind of tree they're in.
Would you, let's say you have somebody who is new to deer hunting, would you introduce them to deer hunting by way of having them hunt during the rut, or would you introduce them to deer hunting by way of having them hunt before or after, or what would your go-to time be?
That's a good question. I think that with the rut, deer activity in general is going to be more scattered, less predictable, but more frequent.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at like an early or a late season time frame when deer are more tied to like a specific food source, it might be more predictable.
In many ways, it's kind of like it probably depends on the person.
Yeah.
You got to sort of know what would trip their trigger, if you will. But you also sort of want to set them up too, if you're trying to get them to be a long-term hunter, for a realistic expectation in some ways of what to be ready for when they go out in the future again by themselves or the following year. So yeah, I'm sure it seems like the rut is exciting. I mean, everybody gets so excited for it. But then some of those other times, I don't want to say it doesn't involve any strategy in the rut, because it certainly does.
Mm-hmm.
But other times it's a little bit more, reminds me almost of General Patton, and advancing very strategically and doing things and understanding what they're going to be doing and when they're going to be doing it and where you're going to be set up, and a little bit less random.
Oh, yeah.
I think the rut is cool because you get to see bucks doing just bucky things.
Yeah.
And they're just doing things that they don't. Maybe they're doing it those other times of year, or even in like earlier in the rut, but just like not at that level.
Yeah.
First time hunter though. I mean, I think you could look at things like, well, is this person going to be like, if they get cold, are they done?
Right.
So
comfort's a huge factor.
An
for
early
beginners.
season hunt might be better for that person.
Oh, so it's not as cold. I know for me, I get bored, which was why. So when my first hunt was a very, very hiking based hunt, and it was just like move spot. Everything was new because we were in a new location. So it was like seeing all kinds of stuff I didn't normally see. It was very grueling, tiring. So when you did stop, it was like, man, I'm glad we stopped.
Yeah.
But then you would stop for a little bit and be like, yeah, this isn't good. It was also probably about as busy as Best Buy on Black Friday there
were some
with
folks
other
out
hunters.
there.
So anyway, you had to always be bouncing around these other hunters, but at least my mind was always active.
Right.
And then I've gone out at times before now and sat, and I can't sit for a half an hour before being like, man, I feel like I want to go chase one down or just do something.
Yeah. The cool thing about the rut, though, is even with that tactic, I think with the whole like mobile thing, I think we're talking specific here a little bit to bow hunting, but even being mobile and doing the spot and stalk thing, like our friends at the hunting public do a lot of ground hunting right now, and you can definitely like get into deer just by being out there in the woods and bouncing from spot to spot. That's a valid tactic, I think, just as much as one guy might want to tie himself to his favorite tree that's set up in the best, ditch crossing funnel or something like that. You might be able to find the same amount of success just going from spot to spot. Yeah.
So. Well, no, I haven't killed a buck this way, but we're talking about, times of day, and, that midday time period can be, like you said, I think any time during the rut can be like, the time, but I've had several instances where I'm going to my stand, getting in a little later than I'd like, so it's breaking daylight, and bucks are running all around, and you almost get a crack at them right when you're getting your stand. You're on the ground, and oftentimes it comes down to a brush issue.
Right.
I've been pulled back, but because I am on the ground and wasn't anticipating an encounter right there or whatever circumstances, you have kind of that brush barrier. You can't kind of I guess that's the advantage, or one advantage of a tree stand is you can kind of shoot down into kind of pocket type openings.
Yeah.
So that's I do enjoy hunting from the tree stand in that regard. But I was just thinking something else that was somewhat.
Pat, what's your go-to for like a newer hunter? What time of year would you take them out?
I think it depends on the time of year and also where you'll be hunting. I mean, I know if I were going to take someone up north hunting the first time, I probably would really concentrate on the rut.
Yeah,
because then your chance of seeing deer are better. But I think some of the more relaxing ways to hunt deer is in that September time period when it first opens up in Wisconsin, when they're on the field edges. And most, I'll be 64 in 2 months, and I think I still see a deer and I still get excited. And I think, and especially when you're hunting and you notice that an animal, you might want to, take a shot at. And I think kids, young people, first timers, if they're comfortable and they're not distracted by, and the colder it is, the less patience they have. Leopold had this great quote in that his San County Almanac about shooting his first duck, and I never forgot it. Where he's sitting in this December afternoon on a little pothole on a little farm pond, and one little spot of open water in it where the windmill pipe comes out and drops water in. He said. He sat there waiting for that. He's thinking that late in the day, there's got to be at least one duck in the area that's going to come back and land in that spot. So he's waiting. He's probably 14, 15 years old at the time, he said. And He describes it as, I got colder with each passing crow. I think hunters understand that sentiment,
Yeah.
and that's, when you sit there in November, I'm like this week's pretty cold in Wisconsin.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's
And
chilly.
if you're not seeing deer, and you're not hearing a crashing in the distance that you know is a deer, all those kind of things that experienced hunters understand as part of the process, it's hard to get a little kid or a beginner convinced that it's gonna be worth it.
Right.
They don't know that yet. So I think I guess I'm more of an early season, get them going in the early season. But then again, though, if you're up north, I'm not a baiter. I just don't. I could, people get mad at me for saying that, but I just do not think deer baiting is the way to go. Because up in the forest, especially during the rut, if it's not, that area's not being baited, it's a lot more fun.
Yeah.
Because those deer are moving naturally, and the does are out feeding, and the bucks are looking for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just a much more interactive, fun way to hunt, I think.
Yep. I
Awesome.
couldn't agree more.
One thing, and if you hunted whites, I think we're kind of been, all deer rut, right? So we've kind of
Right.
been talking, targeting, I guess, whitetails more than anything else. Maybe we've got some other, rut topics that we can do with mule deer and blacktails and things like that. That maybe they're doing. I think they're doing very common things, but maybe somewhat different. But bucks are doing things like you said, Eric. They shed their velvet and they start doing buck things. They start making scrapes. They start making rubs. Maybe certain vocalizations, perhaps. What does that change throughout the rut, or should you be hunting that sign differently as the rut goes through its different stages? Maybe that's the question I'm trying to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Like, should you be hunting scrapes in October, but you don't really need to pay them too much mind in November, and then, or vice versa, or how should we be reading buck sign during the rut, or even from, I'd say, October 25th through November 20th?
I'll let you take the wheel on that one.
You saw me struggling there.
Oh, I know. I get what you're asking though.
Yeah. And the first thing I think Greg Miller is probably the first guy that's really given credit for tying together rub lines. Mm-hmm. And in Greg's book, Rub Line Secrets, I think it was, toward the end of the book, he writes about how he's killed some nice bucks off rub lines. But he said at that point, this is like, I think the late 90s, early 2000s when he wrote that, late 90s. I think he said at the end of that book, it only worked from like 6 times where he actually killed a buck off that rub line. And I think, but it's just like muskie fishermen saying, muskies fish with 10,000 casts. Well, that's what deer hunting's like. You got to be out there a lot, but you still got to take your best shot at what you have. And during the early part of it's probably like, I'd say late October, where they really aren't mating yet, but they're out looking. They're out there hoping that they're going to come across that estrus doe, and there might be some of those early does coming in the estrus that's got them cranked up, so they're moving. And they got this all pent up, and they're going. And so they're probably still moving along those rub lines and maybe scrape lines. And the one great thing I always pass along from John Ozoga's research that I think is really good for guys to keep in mind is when you find a scrape, make sure it has the overhanging branch.
Right.
The one thing he showed in his research is that if there's no overhanging branch, it's just a random scrape. You find a scrape that's out there and there's nothing underneath, no branch has been chewed up. Chances are he'll never come back to that scrape. It's just something he did at random. Maybe another buck confronted him and he was doing that to show us, who's dominant, whatever it might be. But that was one of John's insights that I thought was worth letting people know because.
Interesting.
That is interesting.
Yeah, I definitely think that that sign is something that you really want to pay attention to throughout October, because like you mentioned, Jimmy, like it's like general patent directing traffic, like a plan of attack. It's very specific in late October. You want to be really close to specific areas where deer are bedded. I think in November you can play off that random movement that you're going to get. You can focus more generally on like a travel corridor or like a couple of trails that intersect, rather than, okay, I need to be within 150 yards of this suspected bedding area on this specific wind. I don't think that comes into play as much during the rut, because I think deer are just generally more active. So
Yeah, I think Bill Winke always did a good job of talking about putting yourself in those good travel junctions, pinch points that when these bucks are moving. I think he always talked about. I haven't talked to Bill in years now, but I think in his articles he used to always stress, the topography, geography, and finding those spots where they're naturally funneled through them quickly to get to their spot that they're checking. And Greg Miller, I remember always talking about the fun of finding these spots where there's multiple deer trails, and then everything, the other geographic things would work where he could watch. He says sometimes those bucks would come through, and they'd intentionally go across at a like a 90-degree angle to all those trails, scent checking them.
Yep.
And then doing it from a way they're getting be able to get that scent, right, and they go across right across the next trail, hit that one, next trail.
Yep.
And it's just this really efficient way they use the terrain to move about.
Yep. Bill's thing with the whole like creeks and ditches, like those terrain features, he would literally look at a map and look at terrain features and pick a stand based off what the terrain looked like and disregard any deer sign.
No kidding.
So I think that's an interesting way to look at like hunting the rut. Generically, you can almost pinpoint the areas where you expect deer to move or be funneled by terrain features, like a ditch that comes to an end, and then there's a trail that's going to go around the ditch. Just sit there. Eventually, by 1,000 casts, 10,000 casts, buck's going to come by. So
just like
things.
that.
Yeah.
I'm picturing a spot in my head right now, Eric.
It's about that time.
Jim Shockey had back when Jim was an national, Jim was an excellent writer. He used to write for us at Deer and Deer Hunting magazine back in the 90s, and they got, so big they didn't have time to do all that writing. But he wrote people thought it was, I think they thought it was going to be one of his humorous columns, humorous articles, but it was called The Bald Man's Head. And it goes back to this whole thing about terrain. But Jim told this interesting story about sitting in a movie theater, and the guy in front of him was bald. And he started realizing that the guy on the human head, there's little furrows. And the hair covers those furrows if the guy has a full head of hair like Jimmy does. A bald head like mine, no, you can see all the little indentations as you're in the skull. And Jim started thinking how, you go out in the forest, and when those trees cover the land, you tend not to notice all those little indentations in the land, things that funnel deer. And once you started to think about that land, that forest as always being like the bald man's head, that's when he started to key in on those geographic features that deer tend to use. That's one thing I think everyone would benefit from hunting northern forest environments when there's very low deer densities, very low deer numbers, because you really get good at you might not even see a deer trail, but you look around and you realize this is where a deer would have to come through here, like these edges of these swamps and these corners where there's funnels coming down from little ridge lines and just funnels so many things in one direction. But then you got to play the wind. But it's interesting in that in Ontario, what I typically do is, it'd be snow, no tracks, just random tracks. You start thinking, where would a deer go just naturally in this landscape? And so you go and plunk yourself down there, and it might be a day sometimes, but typically those good terrain features, that's where you'd eventually cross paths with the buck.
Yeah.
It's just, you still look for sign that, because they reopen their scrapes, and when you see some of those big buck tracks in that snow, God, that doesn't keep you motivated to keep hunting.
Yeah. Exactly.
When we were over in Nebraska, I remember trying to get out back to our truck. At one point, we had hiked quite a ways in. we found ourselves in some really thick areas around sort of a waterway. There was a lot of plum thickets, dense trees, and a couple times we sort of got lost, turned around in it. We couldn't figure out where to go. And I remember that it was Ryan Muckenhern who was pointing out, he started looking at the ground and he'd say, here, follow these deer trails. And sometimes you'd see a deer trail go up and it'd be like, I don't really know if that is a way out. But you also have to think to yourself, the deer live here. Like, they know how to get out. Just like in my house, I know how to fiddle with the basement door enough to actually get it to shut all the way. There's these little things that you understand. So if you start following deer trails, you might go deeper in on accident. But if they look like they're going the general direction you're trying to go, chances are they'll get you out or where you want to go.
Well, they're going to pick. I mean, they're no dummies. They know where to walk. They know where
they
it's
don't
easy
like
to
getting
walk
scraped
in.
up
They don't want to be
poked in
getting
the eyes. And
case in point, when I was hunting blacktails this last weekend, my dad shot a buck down in this clear cut. And it was in the bottom of the clear cut, super steep. But we got the deer out, but we took deer trails out. And, it was interesting, though, because I had my Onyx, and, I could see by the topo lines, kind of the most gentle way out, even though there really wasn't a gentle way out. It was still all going to be steep. But those deer trails followed kind of that path of least resistance up the ridge. It was it was interesting how those two married up.
Yeah. And whenever you see that kind of thing, it is sort of like watching ghosts, because you're like, there's a lot of activity here. I never see any of it, and there's none of it around me right now. But clearly it's like a mega superhighway.
Yeah, yep.
But fascinating.
Yes. Fascinating stuff.
Do you guys do much with decoys during the rut?
Oh, that's a really good thing to touch on. I have not in the past personally, but in the days where I used to film hunts, I filmed quite a few of people hunting over them. And one specific hunt that comes to mind is we were hunting in an area where there was a big bottom. So picture a flat area with ridges that come up, and we're set up over a CRP field that was in this bottom. So basically, you're sitting in the bottom of a coliseum, and everything that's up on the ridge tops can see down in that CRP field. My friend who I was filming at the time was setting up a tree stand, and I crept out in there to set the decoy out. And I set the decoy out, and I'm on my way back to the tree, and I can just judge the guy's body language who's in the tree that something was going on. So I kind of crouched down and looked behind me, and there's this great big buck that had come out into he literally must have watched that decoy get set up, and was just so visually struck by the fact that there's now a buck there, and kind of let
it's weird.
Caution
Two-legged creature came out and set this buck down.
But this buck, long story short, he crept in, got downwind of that decoy, and it took just the way that the terrain was. There was a ditch that pushed him where for him to get truly downwind, he had to get pinched by that ditch if he wanted to stay on our side of the CRP field. And long story short, he ended up getting about 10 yards from that decoy, and I was laying on the ground. And the guy who I was filming was up in the tree stand getting everything set up, watching all this, and actually filmed some really cool footage of me laying under the decoy and this buck less than 10 yards away. So I think it's something that is a really good tactic, and I think it can really work. That was a situation where it was an open field. But I definitely think it's something that even in open hardwoods, guys can overlook the effectiveness of it, because, a lot of times we're talking about vocalizations, rattling, grunting, snort wheezing. If you have that visual cue, whether it's a full-size decoy or even the more portable, like the two-dimensional decoys or the little heads-up kind of decoys where it's literally just a deer silhouette head, I think that little visual cue, we've talked about that with guys that are really good elk hunters sometimes, that it just takes that one final element to add that final hook set, so to speak. And I do think that it's a really, really useful tactic. One I don't do a whole lot of, but I know a lot of people that have done it in the past.
Yeah, it's one of those things for me, like I said, some are more packable than others, but some of them can be a little bit cumbersome, and like you said, I think highly effective. And if you have the right place or the right spot, you could, like you said, it's just like that extra. The deer have all these senses, right? And now all of a sudden they've been to, qualify the sound with the sight, and hopefully not the smell, right?
Right.
Then it's over. But
Yeah, I know. one of the things that I haven't done decoys for quite a while, and a lot of this because I'm a full-time freelancer, so I spend a lot of my time behind the desk making a living. But the one thing I remember doing, though, and this is not my idea, it was Judd Cooney's idea, another outdoor writer from my era, where Judd always talked about the importance of a little motion on that decoy.
Yes.
And so he'd do things like just put little white feathers back, tape them on the tail so they just flutter in the slightest wind.
Yeah.
And maybe even put one on right down by the ears, just a little white feather that would give
That's
that.
smart.
Yeah. Because otherwise, so many times, my experience with decoys is that every now and then, the bucks would quite often come out and give it a good look.
Yeah.
The does would start snorting and snorting and snorting at them.
Yeah.
And it was just always, I always thought, well, is this helping or not?
Yeah.
Because if the bucks aren't in the mood, they aren't really going to come in.
Right.
But and the does seem like I never had good things happen with does when they come out. And
Yep.
so often they
Well,
start
that's
snorting.
interesting to think about too. Like on the flip side of that, right? Like sometimes I think it can be nice to have them keep looking.
Right.
They're like, well, it should be here. I'm going to keep coming. I'm going to keep looking. I've had that happen. Sometimes turkey decoys work. Sometimes they don't. I've had them see the decoys and come right in. And I've had them see the decoys and turn around.
Yeah.
And you're like, I know you just saw those decoys. It's
Right.
like, would you have kept coming if I didn't have that out there?
I think the element of adding that motion in the decoy, even if it's something as simple as taking toilet paper and putting it on where the tail is, or there's other options out there like there's Reinhardt actually makes something called the Loma. It's like a 2-dimensional. It actually like pieces together, and it blows a lot in the wind.
Okay.
And that's what the guys at the hunting public use that one all the time. And it's it's packable. It also like is very susceptible to wind movement. And I think the other interesting thing with decoy placement is how you actually set it up. And like that was one thing that when I first started thinking about decoys. Oh, put the decoy in the field or out in front of you and come back and sit in the tree. But I think there's a lot of unique stuff with like what I've always, the train of thought that I've always heard of is to position it quartering towards you because
Right.
a buck especially is going to want to come in and do an about face. So if you have that decoy quartering towards you or almost facing you, even if he does approach from the rear, he's going to want to circle in and approach that thing head on,
Right.
which is going to eventually put him in between you or the decoy and your position and give you a broadside shot. So yeah, it's interesting the little intricacies there. I think it's another element that adds if you're doing calling or anything like that. Definitely something to keep in mind. So
Gosh, I'd hate to be a deer.
I know
Just always trying to get killed.
people are plotting against them all the time.
Literally broadcasting a podcast for many listeners' ears on how to kill you
Yep.
all the time.
And the
writing articles, making videos.
The amazing thing is with all that we think about it, talk about, strategize, with all the advancements in gear over the
GPS
years,
collars.
they're still hard to kill.
And there's still so much more to learn.
Yep.
That there is.
Yep.
Yeah, one of the things Charlie Alsheimer talked about in his writing every now and then was Charlie had served in Vietnam. And he would always talk about once you're in that environment where you are, people are trying to kill you.
Yeah.
He said it just changes everything you do. You don't do anything without being deliberate about it. And so he always figured that deer don't have that ability like we do to see into the future and know all that we have to lose. But they want to live.
Yeah.
Just don't want to die.
Yeah, and then they quickly flip the switch from summer to fall. And I think anyone who ever lets that be forgotten, they'll never be good at deer hunting. And I always go back to some of the different guys I've met over the years who I always call them predators because they're serious about this. I mean, they're having fun, but they're just serious about it. And I realize their focus on that is much more intense than mine will ever be. And I guess my comment I make all the time to folks is just be happy with who you are. Quit being jealous of this guy because so many guys resent the successful hunter.
Yep.
They have this really insecurity or something that they run down guys like Bill Winke and Tony and these other folks we know that are And I think, God, can't you just respect the fact that some people are really good at this?
Yeah.
Right.
And that's, I think that's all this is. Those guys understand what a challenge this is, how good these deer are at that, and they respect it so much. They just work at it so much more intently than the average hunter. And that's where I think there's a reason they're good. And isn't by accident. You can occasionally, I've stumbled into some nice deer over the years just through persistence. But I don't ever put myself in that category as being this guy like Bill.
Yeah.
I just think, no, Bill and Greg Miller and some of these other folks I know, they wouldn't buy it for a second that I was in their league.
Right.
You know? I walk in their home and see what, I've never been in Bill's home, but I've never been in Greg's home for that matter. But I just know from working with them over the years that these are guys I respect. I listen to them.
Yep.
And when they give talks, I don't think Bill's into the talks though.
Not as much anymore.
Yeah, but Miller used to do a lot of talks,
Yep.
and I think he had a certain. Some guys didn't really always like his. I think he was just so super confident.
Yeah.
Right.
That I think some guys didn't like that, and I think, well, you know,
But I don't think
he's earned it.
You can't underestimate the importance of persistence, though. Either. I mean, you bring up.
Well, that's
I think
huge.
That's probably where those guys learned a lot of that persistence and dedication.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And the cool thing too is there's so many, especially in today's day and age, there's so many people who are, you know, they have an expertise on this specific niche. And, you know, like there's something that you can learn from a guy like Bill. There's something you can learn from a guy like, you know, somebody who might be really into hunting on the ground. There might be, you know, there's all these different people that you can look for. And I think the people who are the best learners are the people that can take a little bit from a guy like Bill, take a little bit from this person and just apply that to their hunting situation.
Another guy I know in the Madison area, his name is Jeff Delora. I don't think Jeff's ever made any money out of hunting, but you know, one thing I do like about social media is it lets me see guys like Eric and other folks and what they're up to. And just the other day again, there was Jeff Delora once again with another big buck.
Yeah,
and I know a lot of his skill is he's a great people person. He's a hell of a hunter. He's also a great people person. He knocks on doors and kills bucks in real small little area pockets of cover in these suburban stretches just west of Madison.
Yeah.
I think he gets the access because he's a friendly guy. He's presentable. But again though, you get talking to him, you realize this guy's a predator.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep. We had that discussion with
I'm a predator. Would you let me would you let me in your yard?
Yep. Taylor Chamberlain is another great example.
Oh,
that
yeah,
guy
he
talked
does.
about how he lives in suburbs of Washington D.C. and he hunts like quarter acre, eighth acre little like properties out of like
He's
there
hunting
might be
out of tree forts.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say,
yeah.
like a swing set, and he's truly hunting urban deer, and it's 90%. I would be curious what his thoughts are on this, but I would imagine that a lot of his success is attributed to the fact that he can hold a conversation. Because if he can't hold a conversation, there's no way you're getting that access to that hunting ground. So
Yeah.
it's interesting.
I'm guessing the first words out of his mouth when he knocks on a door and somebody answers the door is, "Hey, can I kill deer in your backyard?"
Yeah. Probably a little more diplomatic.
Yeah. Whew. Wow. Great conversation, though. Pat, thanks a ton for
Thank you.
joining us and talking about the rut and just deer hunting in general. I think the last one we titled with Pat was just a dang good deer hunting conversation, and I feel like we're just going to have to title this one another dang good deer hunting conversation.
Right.
So, appreciate it. And what do you think? Is there anything we should sign off everybody with, Pat? What do you think? Last thoughts?
Guess I didn't really come prepared for that, but
That's all right. I put you on the spot.
No, I guess that my final thought would be, let's also not forget how much of our hunting in this country is based around whitetail deer. That's one thing I really worry about with in our region we're sitting in right now, where chronic wasting disease is a huge factor in this area. And I, as a guy who spent my entire life now, basically adult life, working as an outdoor writer, I think how much this country has built upon the backs of the white-tailed deer, and how much is at stake if we aren't good stewards of it. And I that's where I really push. I believe in the science. I don't believe in all the animosity, the anger, the stuff that people want you to believe because they think this is the way it is. Like, no, I'll throw into the scientists and stand by those guys and hope they can find a way to make this all work for us down the road, because this denying that chronic wasting disease isn't a problem. That when people deny it's a problem, I think they're not doing us any good. So I won't go any further than that right now. But
It's a fantastic last call.
I do worry about it.
Very, very excellent last call to finish on. I definitely agree with that, and think it's something important for a lot of people to think on. So, with that said, everybody, hey, happy hunting and shooting out there. If you listen to this, I think MC Ryan's going to get it edited up and sent out right during the rut. So, yeah, just get pumped.
Yep.
We're in it.
Get in the woods.
It's November. Get outside.
Yep.
If it's not November, you're probably thinking about
buy that extra tag that you're thinking of.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Good luck with that, Eric. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll catch you next time. Bye.
Are you off to Iowa next year or something?
Illinois.
Illinois, okay.
Yep.
Ryan's still filming, by the way, so
Yeah.
screwed. Your spot's gone.
Yeah, I went down there last year and got, I ended up shooting a nice buck on, this area. So it's like now that I don't have any more Wisconsin tags, it's still so early in November. I have all this, vacation that I haven't used all year specifically for November.
You give him too much vacation, he's saying.
Yeah.
I know, he's just left and right. He's gone all over the place.
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
It's like, there's, I was talking to Jameson, another guy that works here. He's like, yeah, I think everyone should take a vacation at some point every year. I'm like, yeah, I couldn't agree more. But for me, that vacation is going to be spent between November 1st and November 14th, and it's going to involve a bow in my hand, So it's one of those things, though. It's like different priorities for every different people,
All right, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Vortex Nation podcast. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hit that subscribe button so you can always stay up to date on the latest happenings over here at the Vortex Nation podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. Again, everybody, thanks, and happy hunting and shooting. We appreciate it. Have a good one.